There is a picture of Montana that arrives before you do. You have seen it, even if you have never been. A wall of mountains, blue and white, standing over a valley so green it looks painted. A river the color of glass, a single road running toward the horizon with nothing on either side but grass and sky. Maybe a barn, maybe a horse, maybe a man in a hat, small against all of it, riding towards something you cannot see. It is one of the last places in America that still looks the way the country is supposed to have looked. Big Sky Country, they call it, and the name is honest. The sky here is genuinely bigger, or seems to be, because there is so little standing up to interrupt it. Fourth largest state in the Union, one of the emptiest. Roughly 7 people for every square mile, in a country that averages nearly 100. And the picture is not a lie. The mountains are real, the rivers are real, the emptiness is real. You can drive for an hour out on the eastern plains and pass 3 cars and 1 town. And the town will be 4 buildings and a grain elevator, and 2 of the buildings will be closed. But the picture leaves something out. It always does. Because a landscape this beautiful is also, and has always been, a landscape that is very hard to live in. And the story of Montana, the real one, underneath the postcard, is not a story about scenery. It is a story about survival, about what it costs to stay in a place that gives you everything to look at and almost nothing to make it easy. About boom and bust, and boom and bust again. A rhythm that has repeated itself here for 160 years, sometimes with gold, sometimes with copper, sometimes with wheat, and sometimes with water, with the simple presence or absence of water. This summer, in the ranch country along the mountains, some of the people who live here are loading tanks onto the backs of their trucks and driving water to their cattle by hand, because the snow that should have filled the creeks did not fall. That is the Montana the postcard does not show you. Not the wildness is true, but the weight of it, the daily arithmetic of living in the wild heart of the Rockies. And to understand it, you have to understand a strange thing about this place. Montana keeps trying to empty itself of people again and again across its history, and once, almost completely, of the animals that defined it. This is the story of how people live here anyway, and of one place, near the end, where something that was taken from this land has quietly, against every expectation, come home. Montana. Start with the water, because right now, everything here starts with the water. Run your eye down the western third of the state, and you find the Rocky Mountains. Not one range, but a tangle of them. The Bitterroots along the Idaho line, the Beartooths in the south, with peaks over 12,000 feet. The Great Wall of the Rocky Mountain front, where the mountains stop all at once and the plains begin. The Continental Divide runs down through all of it, and that divide does something almost nowhere else on the continent does. It splits the water 3 ways. Rain that falls on one side of a single mountain in Glacier National Park can end up in the Pacific. Rain on another side goes to the Gulf of Mexico. Rain on a third goes north, all the way to Hudson Bay. 3 oceans, fed from one crown of rock.
For as long as anyone has lived here,
That arrangement has worked in a particular way. Snow falls on the high country through the winter, deep and slow to melt. Through the spring and into the summer, it releases a little at a time, feeding the creeks and the springs and the stock ponds down in the ranch country below. The mountains are a reservoir made of snow. The ranchers do not think of it that way most of the time. They just know that the water is there when the cattle need it, because it has always been there. This year, across the northern Rockies, the snowpack was the worst on record. Not low, the worst, the bottom of 100 years of measurements. And what that means, out on a ranch, is not abstract. It means the stock pond that has held water every July of a man's life is a cracked dish of dried mud by the middle of June. It means the spring that fed the far pasture is a damp patch, and then nothing. It means the creek you could count on is a line of rounded stones. And so, along the front and out on the high plains, ranchers are doing the thing none of them wanted to do. They are hauling water, filling tanks in town or from whatever well still runs, driving them out over rough dirt roads, pouring them into troughs, and doing it again the next day, because a cow drinks a great deal of water, and a herd drinks an astonishing amount, and the land is no longer providing it. One rancher, working his family's operation, described making 8 trips in 3 vehicles over 9 hours in the heat before 800 cow-calf pairs had enough to drink to make it through to the next day, maybe 2 days. Then he would start again. Another man works a full-time job as his county's water commissioner during the day, the person other people call about water, and then hauls water himself, morning, afternoon, and evening, to his own small herd of 45. He counted himself lucky. His solar well was still producing. Others had stopped. When a well stops in this country, the answer is to drill a deeper one. And so the well drillers are busy this year, punching 400 feet down into the Madison Aquifer, the deep limestone water that underlies part of the region. An option, the drillers will tell you, that is not available everywhere. In some places, the new wells come up dry. In the town of Fairfield, built on the assumption of reliable groundwater, recharged each season by irrigation canals, even that is reaching its limit after years of drought. And in a state where water rights are a form of property older and fiercer than almost any other, the question of who is allowed to pull water out of the ground and how much is becoming one of the hardest questions there is. The drillers, the ranchers, the commissioners, they will mostly tell you the same thing. It is going to take years of good snow to undo this. One of them put a number on it. 10 years of above normal precipitation, he said, to get back to what he would call normal. This is what living in the wild heart of the Rockies looks like in a hard year. Not a vista, a truck, a tank, a dirt road, and a man doing by hand all summer the work that the mountains used to do for free. Hold on to the image of that snow that did not fall. It comes back. Everything here comes back to the water eventually. But to understand why these people stay, why anyone stays in a place that can turn on them like this, you have to go back. Because this is not the first time Montana has tested the people trying to live on it. And it is not the first time the land has tried to empty itself. The last time it happened at full scale, it happened with wheat, and it left ghosts. Drive the High Line, the long, straight run of highway and railroad across the top of the state near the Canadian border, and you will pass them if you know how to look. A stone foundation with no house on it. A collapsed roof settling slowly into the grass. A row of cottonwoods planted in a square, marking where someone once wanted shade, standing now around nothing. Whole towns that are only a name on a map and a few boards the wind has not finished with. These are not old ruins. They are not from some distant century. Most of them were full of people, hopeful people, just over 100 years ago. And the story of how they emptied is one of the great disasters of the American West, and almost nobody outside Montana has heard of it. Go back to 1909. The federal government, wanting to fill in the northern plains, passed a law called the Enlarged Homestead Act. The deal was simple, and it was seductive. Come west. Claim 320 acres of Montana grassland. Live on it, work it, prove it up, and it is yours, nearly free. Railroad companies, who wanted customers and freight, advertised it across the country and across the ocean. Pamphlets promising rich soil and reliable rain, contests with cash prizes for the best sheaves of wheat, photographs of grain standing higher than a man. And for a while, it looked true. The years from 1909 to about 1917 were, by luck, wetter than normal on the Montana plains. The wheat came up thick. The settlers poured in, from the Midwest, from Scandinavia, from Germany and Eastern Europe, and broke the prairie sod with their plows, tens of thousands of families, and built the little towns to serve them, with a post office and a school and a bank and a main street. Then the rain stopped. After 1917, the climate simply returned to what it had always been on the high plains: dry. Drought settled in. And the thing about 320 acres in that country is that it was never enough. A scientist named John Wesley Powell had said so decades earlier, that in land this arid, a family needed thousands of acres, not hundreds, to survive. He was ignored. The homesteaders had been given a plot sized for wet country in a place that was not wet. The wheat that had stood higher than a man began yielding a few bushels an acre, then almost nothing. The soil the plows had broken, with the grass gone, began to blow away in the wind. Cattle starved in the open. The banks that had lent so freely began to fail. More than half of Montana's commercial banks failed in the 1920s. 214 of them closed for good. Farmers who had mortgaged everything, urged on by the government and the bankers to do their patriotic duty and grow food for the war, lost it all. 20,000 mortgages foreclosed, 11,000 farms, 1 in 5 in the whole state, simply abandoned. 2 million acres went out of production, and the people left. 60,000 of them walked away from Montana in the 1920s, most of them for Washington, Oregon, California. In the decade the rest of the country called the Roaring Twenties, when America was getting rich, Montana was the only state in the Union that lost population. One family, leaving, painted a sign and nailed it to their wagon as they went. 20 miles from water, 40 miles from wood. We're leaving old Montana, and we're leaving for good. Remember that sign. 20 miles from water. A family, a century ago, driven off this land because they could not reach it. The towns they left behind did not recover. A place like Goldstone, up near the border, lost its farms, and then lost its reason to exist. The post office closed, the school closed, the store closed, and the settlement that had been built with such optimism was left to the wind. Dozens of towns went the same way. You can still find them, the ghost towns of the High Line, and they are not the romantic ghost towns of the gold rush with saloons and legends. They are quieter and sadder than that. They are the bones of ordinary people who were told this land would provide and believed it and were wrong. And yet, this is the thing about Montana. Not everyone was wrong. The ranchers, the ones who had been here before the homestead rush, who ran cattle across the big open country instead of plowing it into small squares. They mostly held on. Their way of life was older and better fitted to the land. It bent under the drought and the falling prices, but it did not break. And that is the pattern that keeps repeating here, all the way down to the trucks hauling water this summer. The land punishes the people who try to force it into being something it is not. And it makes a hard, narrow room for the people who learn to live with what it actually is. The whole state is built on that pattern, and it started, as so much here started, with a metal in the ground. In the summer of 1864, 4 discouraged prospectors, on their way out of the territory after a season of finding nothing, stopped to try one last gulch. They called it, with no great hope, Last Chance Gulch. They struck gold. Within weeks, the gulch was a camp. Within a year, the camp was a town, and that town, Helena, grew rich enough and stubborn enough that it is the capital of Montana to this day. Its main street still follows the crooked line of the original diggings. The gold that built it is long gone, but the town stayed, one of the few gold rush settlements in the West that did not become a ghost. Gold started it, but gold is not what made Montana matter to the rest of the world. That was a duller, redder metal, and it came out of a single hill in the southwest of the state, a hill that would be called, without much exaggeration, the richest on earth. The town is Butte, and to understand Montana, you have to sit with Butte for a while, because Butte is where the whole bargain of this state, beauty and cost, boom and ruin, is written most plainly on the ground. In the 1880s, as the demand for copper exploded to wire a newly electric world, the hill under Butte turned out to hold one of the greatest concentrations of it anywhere. And Butte became something Montana had never had and has never had since. A real city, a loud, crowded, cosmopolitan industrial city in the middle of the mountains. Tens of thousands of miners came, from Ireland above all, but from Cornwall, from Finland, from Italy, from China, from a dozen countries, and went down into a hill that was hollowed out beneath them into thousands of miles of tunnels. At its peak, around the First World War, Butte produced a quarter of all the copper in the world, over half of what the United States used. More than 20 billion pounds of copper came out of that hill across the mining years. The wealth was almost unimaginable, and it did not stay in Butte. It went to a handful of men. One of them, William Andrews Clark, made a fortune from that copper so large that around 1900 he was worth more than most countries. His mansion still stands in uptown Butte, and you can tour it. Down the hill from it sits the other thing the copper left behind. Because here is the contradiction that is Butte, stated as plainly as it can be stated. The richest hill on earth is also the site of the most poisoned water in America. Both of those are literally, measurably true, and they are the same hill. After the Second World War, the easy veins ran thin, and the company changed its method. Instead of tunneling for high-grade ore, it began to dig the whole hill away from the top down in an enormous open pit, the Berkeley Pit. And to dig it, it needed the land that people were living on. So the Anaconda Company bought the working-class neighborhoods east of the pit. Meadville, McQueen bought the homes and the businesses and the school and the beloved Columbia Gardens, the amusement park and green space that generations of Butte children had grown up in. Bought them and demolished them and dug where they had been. Whole communities fed into the growing hole. By 1982, when the copper price collapsed and the new owners shut the mine down, the Berkeley Pit was a crater a mile long, half a mile wide, and more than a quarter of a mile deep. Nearly 1.5 billion tons of the hill had been carried out of it. And then the pumps stopped. For all the decades of mining, deep pumps had kept the groundwater out of the tunnels and the pit. When the mine closed, the pumps were switched off, and the water, which had been held back for a century, began, slowly, to come back. It seeped in from the surrounding rock through the old workings, and it began to fill the pit. But the water did not come in clean. Moving through rock full of exposed metals and sulfides, it turned acidic, and it dissolved what it touched: copper, arsenic, cadmium, zinc, iron. It became, by the measure of the people who study it, acidic enough to dissolve the steel propeller of a boat. 40 billion gallons of it, and rising, roughly a foot every month, red and green and dead. It is now one of the largest sites in the biggest complex of poisoned ground in the United States. A Superfund site, the government calls it, a chain of them stretching 140 miles from Butte down the valley. There is no economically feasible way, the environmental agency concluded, to ever truly clean the pit. It can only be managed, watched, kept forever from rising into the water that the living still drink. And there was one more thing about that rising water that no one had planned for. Something that would twice turn the pit from an industrial problem into an image people could not forget. From the air, at the right moment, the Berkeley Pit looks like a lake. Every autumn, the snow geese come down out of the Arctic, hundreds of thousands of them, crossing Montana on the long migration from their breeding grounds in the far north to the wintering waters of the south. They fly high, in great honking rivers of white, and they come down to rest on lakes and ponds along the way. Freezing Lake, Warm Springs Ponds, the familiar stopping places their kind have used for longer than there has been a Butte. In late November of 1995, a flock came through in bad weather. The usual ponds were frozen, and below them, not frozen, catching the last light, was a wide, flat sheet of water that looked, from the air, like exactly the refuge they needed. They came down onto the Berkeley Pit. 342 of them did not fly out again. When the workers pulled the bodies from the acid, the birds' white feathers had been stained rust orange, and inside, the necropsies found their throats and stomachs lined with burns and sores. The company was made to act. For the next 2 decades, they ran a hazing program. Lights, loud noises, recorded predator calls, rifle shots into the air, anything to keep the geese off the water. And for 2 decades mostly, it worked. A handful of birds a year, no more. Then came the night of November 28, 2016. An unusually warm autumn had held the geese late on their journey south. And then a snowstorm hit, hard and sudden, and drove them out of the sky all at once. Not a flock, tens of thousands of birds, by some counts 25,000, by one estimate 60,000, circling Butte in the dark, honking, desperate, looking for anywhere to land. The workers were overwhelmed. They fired and flashed and shouted, and still the geese came down, flock after flock after flock, until witnesses said the surface of the pit looked like 700 acres of white birds. In a normal year, the whole region might see a few thousand geese across all its seasons. That night, the poison lake was covered in them. Thousands died. The estimate settled around 3,000 birds, drinking deadly water because a storm gave them no other choice, on the drowned remains of the richest hill on Earth. That is the full cost of the copper, made visible in a single night. The wealth that wired the world went to a few men a century ago. The bill for it is paid still by whatever lands on the water. And yet, even here, even in the pit, the land does the strange thing it always does in Montana. It does not stay entirely dead. In water, acidic enough to kill a goose in hours, biologists have found life. Microscopic organisms, some of them found nowhere else, that have adapted to living in the poison. Extremophiles, they are called. Some of the compounds they produce are being studied as possible medicines. Life did not leave the Berkeley pit. It changed shape and stayed, which is, if you think about it, the most Montana thing the pit could possibly do.
Now lift your eyes off the pit
And put them back on the mountains, because there is a reason the whole world knows the northern edge of this state, and it deserves its moment. In the far northwest, where the Rocky Mountain front meets the Canadian line, is Glacier National Park. The crown of the continent, the mapmakers call it, the high knot of rock from which the three ocean waters flow. It is, by common agreement, one of the most beautiful places in North America. Peaks like turrets, lakes so clear and cold and still that the mountains stand upside down in them, perfect. Valleys carved by ice into long green troughs. A single road, the Going to the Sun Road, cut impossibly into the side of the mountains, that draws people from all over the earth just to drive it. This is the postcard. This is the picture that arrives before you do. And it is not a lie. It is, if anything, more beautiful in person than in the photograph. But look at the name again. Glacier. The park was named for the ice. When it was established, more than a century ago, it held around 150 glaciers. It now holds fewer than 30, and they are shrinking. The ice that named the place, that carved every valley and lake the visitors come to see, is leaving. The scientists who measure it expect the active glaciers to be functionally gone within the lifetimes of children alive today. The mountains will remain, the name will remain. But the thing the name describes is quietly, measurably disappearing. The same failure of snow and cold that has the ranchers hauling water 200 miles south, written here in ice instead of dust. The crown of the continent is losing its jewels, slowly enough that a single visitor on a single perfect day would never see it. Fast enough that the place will not look the same to your grandchildren as it does in the photograph on your wall. And here is a thing the postcard hides completely. Montana is named for its mountains. The word comes from the Spanish for mountainous. But Montana is mostly not mountains at all. The mountains fill the western third. The other two-thirds, the whole vast eastern reach of the state, is the Great Plains, an ocean of grass and wheat and sky that runs flat and enormous all the way to the Dakotas. This is the emptiest country in one of the emptiest states in America. You can drive 100 miles out here and feel the curve of the earth. The towns are far apart and small and getting smaller. The wind never stops. And the scale of it does something to a person that the mountains, for all their grandeur, do not. The mountains contain you. They give the eye walls to rest on, and the plains give the eye nothing. Nothing but distance, until you understand in your body how much of this state is simply space. It was across this space, in the summer of 1805, that the explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark pushed up the Missouri River, the first Americans to cross it, mapping a country that was already, of course, deeply known and long inhabited by the people who lived on it. Their route still threads through the state, marked at 100 sites. They passed the White Cliffs and the Missouri Breaks, that maze of eroded badlands where the river has cut down through the plains, some of the least changed country in the United States, land that looks almost exactly as it looked when they saw it. And along the way, they carried in their journals the first written descriptions of the animal that covered this land in numbers no one now can quite imagine. Herds, they wrote, that darkened the whole plain, herds that took days to pass. Bison in the tens of millions, the beating engine of the entire prairie ecosystem and the center of life for every nation of people who lived upon it. Hold on to that too, the darkened plain, the herds without end. It is the last thing you need before the end of this story, and it is the thing this story has been walking toward all along. Before you go west, though, there is one more corner of the plains to see, down in the south, along the northern edge of Yellowstone. Because what happens there tells you exactly how hard the ground still is beneath the good news. And it involves the same animal the whole story has been circling. Yellowstone National Park spills across the state line into the far south of Montana, and inside the park is the one place in America where wild bison never entirely disappeared. When the Great Slaughter reduced the national herd to a few hundred, a tiny remnant, around 24 animals, survived by taking refuge in a remote valley deep inside what became the park. Every wild plains bison alive today, on the Blackfeet Reservation and everywhere else, traces back in part to survivors like those. They are the thread that was never quite cut. But the bison in Yellowstone do not know they are in a park. In hard winters, when the snow buries the grass inside the park, they do what bison have always done. They move, following the ground down to lower country to feed. And when they cross the invisible line at the park's northern edge, out onto the ranch land of Paradise Valley in Montana, they walk into a century-old conflict. Because some of the Yellowstone bison carry a disease called brucellosis, which can cause cattle to lose their calves, and Montana's cattle industry, worth far more to the state's economy than its wild bison, has fought for decades to keep the two apart. So the animals that leave the park are met at the boundary. Some are hazed back, others are captured and tested, and if they cannot be placed elsewhere, sent to slaughter. Over the years, many thousands of Yellowstone bison have been killed this way, simply for crossing a line they cannot see, off land that cannot feed them in winter, onto land where they are not wanted. There is a bitter irony folded into it. The disease that justifies the slaughter has never once, in the wild, been documented passing from a Yellowstone bison to a cow. The only proven wildlife carrier is the elk, and elk are not killed for leaving the park. But the fear is old, and the stakes for a ranching family are real. And so the killing continues, argued over in courtrooms and legislatures year after year, even as the same species is celebrated on its return a few hundred miles north. That is Montana in a single animal. In the north, on tribal land, the buffalo is brought home as an act of renewal. In the south, at the park's edge, the buffalo is turned back at the fence. The same creature, the same state, pulling in two directions at once, because the land is still limited. The water and the grass are still finite, and the question of who and what gets to live on it has never once been settled easily here. There are also wolves in this southern country now, brought back to Yellowstone in the mid-1990s after being hunted out of it entirely, and they too are loved and resented in almost equal measure for exactly the same reason. In Montana, nothing wild comes back without someone paying for it, and someone arguing about it. Now come west, to the green valleys between the mountains, because that is where the newest chapter of Montana is being written, and it is not a simple one either. Missoula sits in a bowl of hills where 5 valleys meet, a river running through the middle of it, a university on its bank. For most of its life, it was a timber town, cutting and milling the forests of the northern Rockies. The mills are mostly gone now, the way the mines went, the way the homesteads went. Another Montana industry that boomed and then, one way or another, busted. What replaced them is the thing reshaping the whole western part of the state. People from elsewhere who saw the postcard and decided they wanted to live inside it. And who could blame them? But it has made for a tense and complicated present. The towns of western Montana, Missoula, Bozeman down south, the Flathead Valley up north, are among the fastest changing places in the American West. Newcomers arrive with money made somewhere else and buy land, and the price of a house climbs past what the people who have always lived here, the ranch families and the mill workers and the teachers, can possibly pay. The character that drew the new arrivals, the openness, the quiet, the working landscape, is exactly what their arrival puts under pressure. And underneath all of it, again, is the water. Every new house needs a well. Every well pulls from the same aquifers that are already straining. In a valley like the one around the small town of Fairfield, the limits are already showing. The oldest tension in Montana, too many people wanting to live on land that can only support so many, is playing out again, in a new form, with lawns and subdivisions where there used to be wheat. North of Missoula, the valleys open onto Flathead Lake, the largest natural freshwater lake west of the Mississippi, a sheet of clear, cold water 28 miles long, cradled by mountains, its shores now lined with orchards and homes and the same pressure of arriving money that is remaking the whole western half of the state. The lake sits within the Flathead Reservation, home to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and that fact carries its own quiet piece of the larger story. Because on this reservation sits a place called the National Bison Range, some of the very ground where, more than a century ago, the animal was pulled back from the edge of extinction, when a handful of people gathered a few surviving calves and kept a herd alive while the wild ones were being wiped out. For 100 years, That range was run by the federal government on tribal land, without the tribes. And then, just a few years ago, in a change that went almost unnoticed outside Montana, the land and the herd were formally restored to the Salish and Kootenai to manage themselves. It is a smaller, quieter echo of what happened under Chief Mountain, the buffalo, and the responsibility for the buffalo coming back into the hands of the people who had lived with them longest. This is the modern face of the old pattern. The land is beautiful, the land is limited, and the number of people who can actually live on it in the end is set not by how much they love it, but by how much water there is. Which brings us at last back to the animals, and to the one place in this whole hard-used state where the story bends unmistakably the other way. For as long as there have been people in Montana, and there have been people here for more than 10,000 years, those people lived with the bison, not near them, with them. The nations of this land, the Blackfeet along the mountains in the north, the Crow to the south and east, the Cheyenne, the Assiniboine, the Gros Ventre, the Salish and Kootenai in the western valleys, and others, built entire ways of living around the herds. The bison were food, and they were also shelter, tools, clothing, cordage, fuel, and the center of ceremony and story and identity. The Blackfeet word for the animal, and the whole world it held, runs through their language and their sense of who they are. To be a person of these plains was, in the deepest sense, to be a person of the buffalo. The two could not be separated. For thousands of years, no one tried to. And then, in the span of a single human lifetime, the herds were destroyed. Go back to the 1870s and 80s. The tens of millions of bison that Lewis and Clark had described darkening the plains were hunted down to almost nothing, shot from trains, shot for their hides, shot for their tongues, shot and left to rot, and shot, deliberately and as a matter of policy, in order to starve the native nations of the plains into submission and onto reservations. This was understood at the time. It was said aloud. Destroy the buffalo, and you destroy the people who depend on them. Take away the food, and you take away the freedom. It worked. By around 1890, of the tens of millions of bison that had covered the continent, a few hundred wild animals remained alive in the entire United States. A few hundred out of tens of millions in 20 years. It is one of the fastest and most total destructions of a wild animal in recorded history, and it was not an accident. It was a strategy, aimed as much at the people as at the animals. And the people it was aimed at were pushed onto fractions of their former land, their central relationships severed, told to become farmers on ground that, as the homesteaders would later prove, could barely be farmed at all. The plains went quiet. The great engine of the prairies stopped. And for more than a century, across the country where the herds had run without end, there were no wild bison at all, only cattle and the wind and the memory, held stubbornly in the nations that had not been destroyed with their buffalo, of a world that had been taken. That is the emptying, not of people this time, but of the animal that made the people who they were. The deepest wound in the whole long history of this state. And for 100 years, it looked permanent. It looked like something that could be mourned, but never undone. It is being undone. In the far north of Montana, the Blackfeet Reservation runs east from the mountains of Glacier out onto the plains, beneath a sacred summit called Chief Mountain that stands alone and unmistakable on the horizon. It is hard country. Browning, the reservation's largest town, is a place where a hard winter is measured in who ran out of propane and who lost cattle. The reservation carries all the weight that reservations carry: the poverty, the distance, the century of loss. It would be easy, driving through, to see only what was taken. But something has been happening on this land that changes the whole shape of the story. Starting years ago, a small group of Blackfeet people, working with biologists and conservation groups, set out to do a thing that had not been done in 130 years: to bring the buffalo home. Not cattle, not a petting zoo handful, wild bison, descended some of them from the very animals that had once run these plains, held in the meantime in places like Elk Island in Canada, carrying the old prairie genetics forward through the long absence. They called it the Ini Initiative, after the Blackfeet word for buffalo, and they did something larger than a wildlife project. They helped build an agreement, the Buffalo Treaty, signed now by more than 30 tribes and First Nations across the United States and Canada, all of them committing to restore the bison to their lands. Together, across the border, that means nothing to a buffalo. One of its architects, a Blackfoot scholar, said the treaty was not really about the past at all. It maps the future, he said, 7 generations ahead. And then, in 2016, they let the animals go. On Blackfeet land, near Chief Mountain, on the contested edge where the reservation meets Glacier National Park, a herd of wild bison was released back onto open ground for the first time in well over a century. The tribe's leaders wrote down what it meant to them, and the words are worth sitting with. They said they were expressing their sovereignty, reclaiming their rights, reversing an ecological deterioration, overturning an incalculable cultural loss, righting historic wrongs, and preparing, they wrote, a powerful path for a successful future, the path of the buffalo. There are wild bison in Montana again, on the plains where the herds were destroyed, released by the descendants of the people the destruction was meant to break. The Blackfeet manage hundreds of them now. Calves are born on the reservation each spring, knock-kneed and golden brown beside their mothers, on grass their kind had not touched in 100 years. And they are not alone in coming back. The grizzly bear, the official animal of this state, gone from the plains for generations, is quietly reclaiming its old range too, moving back out of the mountains and onto the prairie east of Glacier, onto Blackfeet land, so that the tribe now tracks the bears with radio collars the way their ancestors once tracked the herds. The old plains ecosystem, buffalo, bear, grass, and the people woven through all of it is, in this one corner of Montana, reassembling itself. It is not simple. Nothing here is. Wild bison remain deeply controversial in a state built on cattle ranching, treated by the law in most places as livestock or nuisance rather than wildlife, hemmed in by fences and politics and old fears. The herd near Chief Mountain is small against the scale of what was lost. No one is pretending the plains of 1805 are coming back. The wound is not healed. It is being tended. But tending is not nothing. In a state whose entire history is a record of things that boomed and busted, of towns that emptied and industries that died and water that failed, here is a thing that was taken as completely as anything has ever been taken, and that is, against all of it, walking back onto the grass under its own power. Which is, in the end, the truth the postcard cannot hold. Not the beauty, The beauty is easy. The truth is harder and better than the beauty. It is that living in the wild heart of the Rockies has never been about the view. It has been about staying. Through the drought and the bust, the emptied towns and the poisoned hill, the winter that takes the cattle and the summer that takes the water. About the specific, stubborn refusal of particular people to leave a place that keeps giving them reasons to. The rancher hauling water to his herd this summer, 20 miles by truck over a dirt road, is doing the exact thing a family fled this land to escape 100 years ago, 20 miles from water, except that he is not fleeing. He is staying. He is doing by hand the work the mountains used to do and betting against a decade of drought that the snow will come back. The people of Butte, who live beside the most poisoned water in America, did not abandon their city. They stayed and made it safer and cleaner than it has ever been, and argue still over how to remember what the copper cost without letting it become the only thing their home is known for. And the Blackfeet, who were meant to be broken along with their buffalo, were not broken. They kept the language and the ceremonies and the memory of the herds across 100 years of absence until they were able to open a gate and let the memory walk back out onto the plains as a living animal. Montana keeps trying to empty itself. That is the true story under the postcard, a hard, extracted, boom and bust country that has driven people off its land again and again, and once nearly erased the animal at the center of everything. The snow that did not fall this year is only the newest version of a very old test. But the answer people keep giving here is to stay anyway, to hold the water, to tend the wound, to bring the buffalo home, to live in the wild heart of the Rockies, not because it is easy, it has never once been easy, but because, for the people who belong to it, there has never been anywhere else worth living so hard to stay. That is how people live in Montana, not in the postcard, underneath it, in the long, stubborn, unfinished work of holding on. If you would like to keep exploring the places most of the world only ever sees from a distance, stay with us. There is a great deal of Earth left to understand, and we are only just getting started.